Bitcoin is quite unique because it's the only industry in the world that anytime soon has the option to actually go greenhouse negative without having to buy offsets. And what I mean by that is it could actually reduce more emissions than it creates. Now, how do you do that? Well, basically you do it by using pollution as an energy source. So let's go into it more. So last year I asked the question, if we used flare gas as a source of energy for Bitcoin, how many megawatts would it take to make the Bitcoin network greenhouse negative? And the answer was 2,700 megawatts. Now, just so you know, flare gas, what it means is in the oil and gas industry, but also in landfills, they flare methane. The problem is that the flaring is incomplete burning. 9% of the methane still escapes. So when you don't flare it, and that methane has some devastating climate consequences, when you don't flare it, but you instead send it to a generator and you use it for electricity production, you're mitigating almost 100% of the methane. Therefore, it's emission reducing. Now, 2,700 megawatts, that's a lot of megawatts. That would take 40 years if we were to do it that way. So then I asked a second question. What if we had Bitcoin mining that was powered by sources of previously vented methane, such as from landfills? And the answer was 280 megawatts. And I thought, well, that sounds doable. It's a stretch, but that's possible. I asked how much infrastructure financing that would take. It would take 450 million. I thought, well, that's doable. And then a couple of investors reached out, said, hey, should we start a fund? And I said, yes, let's do due diligence on it. And 1.5 years later, we have actually formed a fund which is now specializing in exactly this area of methane mitigation using landfills as a fuel source. Called it CH4 Capital. So here's how it works. So you have a landfill. It has some gas capture and collection system in place. Now, the interesting thing here is that for any modern landfill in the West, they will almost always have some sort of gas capture and collection. And the reason is not environmental, it's actually health and safety. And that's because if you have a landfill, you'll get a buildup of methane, and you have to have some way to allow that methane to escape. And that's done through these perforated vertical wells. If you don't let the methane escape, there's two risks. Number one is subsidence when you're driving heavy machinery over the top of the landfill, which is an obvious health and safety risk. The second risk is they could actually catch fire. So this gas capture and collection is already partially in place. Now, what we do if you want to use that for power generation is you then put a well head in place. You basically connect all the pipes. You purify that landfill gas. You take out the condensation, and in some cases you need to take out the siloxanes, and you also need to compress it because it's coming out at low pressure, so it goes at high pressure to a generator. The generator will generate electricity, and then you can sell it to the grid. This is actually happening at the Redvale landfill, which I visited last month. Right now, they've got 14 megawatts of power generation going on, so probably at around 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So do the maths on that. They're doing some pretty good business out of that. I mean, from my calculation, it's probably about $10 million in revenue from that gas coming from landfills, turning into electricity, sold to the grid. The problem is it's not always possible to sell it to the grid. The grid might not be able to take that electricity. It might be an aging grid. They might need a substation upgrade, so it's too much infrastructure, or there may be some regulatory reasons that it's just not possible. So in those cases, when you got 2 out of 3, it's not good enough. You need a third use. And so I asked this guy, Nuno Barbosa, who's been doing landfill gas-based power generation for 20 years. Well, you know, what if you, rather than send it to the grid, you had an on-site user for that power? And he said, that would change everything. I asked him how many landfills in the world have no option to sell to the grid. He said 50%. That's a huge number. Now, let's look at why this number is so significant. So methane is 84 times as warming as carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. It's growing at a parabolic rate currently. Carbon dioxide rates are growing linearly. And the United Nations has declared it actually our strongest lever to slow climate change over the next 25 years. So in terms of sources of anthropogenic methane, landfills is 17%. So if half of those landfills you can't do anything with. That's the problem. So here's what we want to do. When you can't sell that power to the grid, you could use it to do Bitcoin mining instead. Now, the key thing here is that you might be thinking, well, couldn't you use that energy to do something else other than Bitcoin mining? And the answer is no, because remember, Bitcoin miners are the only users who would have the incentive to want to pay that capex to of the operational costs is electricity. So for traditional data centers, maybe 30% of their costs might be electricity. It's just not a high enough incentive for them to pay that extra capex. But Bitcoin miners will chase that cheap electricity to the edge of the earth, even if it's smelly, messy landfills. So that's significant. So what that means is that they're the only ones who are going to chase that cheap power. Now, landfill emissions, it turns out, are 2.27 times higher than the Environmental Protection Agency of the US estimated. We know that from some NASA data that was done in 2022, where they looked at 6 years of actual aerial coverage and measuring and monitoring landfill emissions. And so if we recalibrate the real consequence of landfills to methane, it's not 17%, it's close to 30% of anthropogenic methane emissions. And then if we look at the growth rates of methane emissions from landfills relative to agriculture, within 10 years, it's on track on the current trend to be a major source of methane emissions. So if Bitcoin mining has the theoretical potential to handle half of 30%, that's 15% of all methane emissions globally. That's significant. Key thing here is, unlike the technologies I've been investing in for the last 5 years, which are novel technologies that may or may not work, you can do this using existing technology. You can have a pre-2030 impact. And so in my view, this makes Bitcoin mining potentially the greatest ESG asset of our time, certainly the best one I've seen. And I've seen over 100 different climate tech ideas over the last 8 to 10 years. So we asked Nuno to join our fund, and he said yes. We asked a couple of other friends to join our fund, and they said yes as well. And so now we're doing it. So we're basically raising this $50 million fund. It's going to have the impact of planting 150 million trees. With that amount of infrastructure capital, it'll have the consequence of reducing 4 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And it's that much, remember, because methane is 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide. And we can do that with 1 year from the launch date of that fund. So that will actually mitigate 11% of Bitcoin's entire emissions as a network. Here's where we are right now with the flare gas mitigation that's happening. There's already about 6% of Bitcoin network emissions mitigating. Our target is to get to 100% and not to stop there, but actually to keep on going and have that be the first major industry in the world which achieves greenhouse negativity without offsets.